The year was 1692, and Salem village lived in fear. Every shadow could hide a witch. Every strange noise could be the devil himself. But in the small wooden house at the edge of town, 16-year-old Prudence Fairweather sat by her window and smiled at the darkness outside. The storm had been raging for 3 days now. Thunder crashed overhead like the sound of God himself walking across the heavens. Lightning split the black sky and lit up Prudence's pale face for brief moments. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes reflected the lightning like pieces of broken glass. Prudence was not like other girls in Salem village. While they spent their days sewing and cooking and praying, she spent hers watching. She watched the way people walked when they thought no one was looking. She watched how their faces changed when they were angry or scared or sad. Most of all, she watched how they acted when they thought they were alone. Her father, Ezekiel Fairweather, sat in his chair by the dying fire. His clothes were old and patched. His face was thin and hollow from worry. Once he had been a successful merchant who traded with ships from Boston. Now he had nothing left but debts and shame. "Prudence," he said without looking at her. His voice was rough like gravel. "Come away from that window. Nothing good comes from staring into storms." But Prudence did not move. Something was calling to her from outside. Something that made her skin tingle and her heart beat faster. She pressed her face against the cold glass and breathed on it until it fogged up. Then she drew a small symbol in the moisture with her finger. It was a symbol she had never seen before, but somehow knew how to make. The moment her finger finished the last line of the symbol, the storm stopped. Not slowly like storms usually end, but all at once. The wind died. The rain stopped. Even the thunder went silent. The sudden quiet was more frightening than all the noise had been. "What did you do, girl?" Ezekiel whispered. He had seen her draw on the window. His hand shook as he gripped the arms of his chair. Prudence turned to look at her father. In the flickering firelight, his face looked like a skull. "I did not do anything, Father. Perhaps God has answered your prayers." But even as she said the words, she knew they were not true. Something had answered her call, but it was not God. That night, after her father had gone to bed, Prudence sat alone in the kitchen. She had found her mother's old wooden box hidden under loose floorboards. Inside were things that made her pulse quicken. A black leather book filled with strange writing, dried herbs tied with red thread, small bones from animals she could not name, and at the bottom a letter written in her mother's careful handwriting. The letter told a story Prudence had never heard before. Her mother Elizabeth had not died of fever, as her father always said. She had been accused of witchcraft by the women of Salem village. They said she spoke to spirits and made dark bargains. They said she cursed crops and made children sick with nightmares. "But I am no witch, my daughter," the letter said. "I am something far older and more dangerous. We are the daughters of the weeping woman. Her blood runs in our veins. When you are old enough, you will hear her calling. When that day comes, remember that we take what is owed to us." Prudence felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories of the weeping woman since she was small. Long ago, a young bride had thrown herself into Salem Creek on her wedding night. They said her spirit still wandered the woods looking for men who hurt women and children. As Prudence read the letter again, she began to hear something. At first, it sounded like the wind in the trees, then like someone crying far away. Finally, she realized it was footsteps, wet footsteps walking in circles around her house. The footsteps stopped right outside the kitchen window. Prudence stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak and her mouth was dry. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but black trees and empty fields. Then a pale shape moved between the shadows. It was a woman in a white dress that had once been beautiful but now hung in tatters. Her long hair dripped with water that fell to the ground like tears. Her face was the color of moonlight, and her eyes were black holes that seemed to pull at Prudence's soul. The woman raised one dripping hand and pointed directly at Prudence. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out, but Prudence heard the words as clearly as if they had been whispered in her ear. "Child of my blood, it is time to learn what you truly are." Prudence's hand moved to the window latch without her telling it to. She opened the window and the smell of river water and rotting leaves filled the kitchen. The woman glided closer until she was standing just outside the window. Up close, Prudence could see that her skin was blue-white like a drowned person. Water streamed constantly from her hair and clothes but never seemed to run out. "Your mother fought against her nature," the spirit said. "She tried to live like other women. She married a weak man and pretended to be something she was not. But you will not make the same mistake." "What am I?" Prudence whispered. "You are my daughter in spirit, if not in blood. You are the one who will collect the debts that are owed. The men of this village have hurt women and children for too long. They think their God will protect them. They are wrong." The weeping woman reached through the window and touched Prudence's forehead with one cold, wet finger. The touch burned like ice and made Prudence's vision blur. Suddenly she could see things that had happened in Salem Village. Men hitting their wives behind closed doors, fathers selling their daughters to settle gambling debts, masters forcing themselves on servant girls who had nowhere to run. "Do you see?" the spirit asked. "Do you understand why we exist?" Prudence nodded. The anger that had always lived in her heart began to grow stronger. All her life she had watched people pretend to be good while doing evil things when no one was looking. Now she had the power to make them pay. "Your father plans to sell you to old Thomas Hartwell to pay his debts," the weeping woman continued. "Thomas beats his horses and kicks his dogs. He will do worse to you, unless you stop him first." "How?" Prudence asked. The spirit smiled, and her teeth were black like river stones. "I will teach you, child. I will teach you everything you need to know. But first you must prove you are ready. Tonight your father will dream of drowning. When he wakes, he will be changed. After that, we will begin your real education." The weeping woman stepped back from the window. As she moved away, she began to fade like mist in the morning sun. But her voice remained clear and strong. "Remember, Prudence Fairweather, we are not evil. We are justice. We give people exactly what they deserve. Nothing more and nothing less." Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of pond water and the sound of dripping that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Prudence closed the window and sat back down at the kitchen table. She felt different now, stronger. The scared little girl who had opened her mother's letter was gone. In her place sat someone who knew exactly what she had to do. From her father's room came the sound of troubled sleep. He was making small gasping noises like someone who could not breathe. Prudence smiled and began to read her mother's book. She had so much to learn and so little time. Outside, the wind began to blow again, but now it sounded like whispered promises. The storm was coming back, but this time Prudence would be ready for it. This time she would be the storm. 3 months had passed since Ezekiel Fairweather died in his sleep. The village doctor said his heart had simply stopped, but Prudence knew better. She had watched through her bedroom door as the weeping woman stood over his bed that night. She had seen her father's eyes open wide with terror as water filled his lungs even though his mouth never opened. Now Prudence lived with her Aunt Mehitable in a house that smelled like boiled cabbage and broken dreams. Mehitable was a thin woman with sharp elbows and an even sharper tongue. She spent her days complaining about having to feed another mouth and her nights reading scripture by candlelight. "You are a burden, girl," Mehitable would say every morning while stirring the thin porridge. "But God tests us all. Perhaps caring for you will earn me a place in heaven." Prudence would nod and keep her eyes down. But inside she was counting the days until her wedding. Thomas Hartwell had agreed to marry her despite having no dowry. He said he needed a young wife to help with his farm and give him sons. What he really wanted was someone he could control. Thomas was 50 years old with hands like tree roots and breath that smelled like sour ale. His first wife had died 3 years ago. The village women whispered that she had fallen down the stairs, but Prudence had learned the truth from the weeping woman. Mary Hartwell had not fallen. She had been pushed after refusing to share her bed with a husband who came home drunk and violent. Every night since her father's death, the weeping woman came to Prudence. Not always in the same form. Sometimes she appeared as the drowned bride in white. Other times she looked like Mary Hartwell with a broken neck and bruises on her throat. But always she brought the same message. He must pay for what he has done. The wedding was set for the first day of spring. As the date grew closer, strange things began happening around the village. Wells that had never run dry suddenly turned brackish and undrinkable. Children woke screaming from dreams of drowning. Several men reported seeing a woman in white walking through their fields at night, leaving behind puddles of muddy water. Prudence felt the change in herself too. Her reflection in mirrors had begun to shift and blur. Sometimes when she looked, she saw her own face. Other times she saw the weeping woman staring back at her. Her breath turned to mist even on warm days. When she touched metal, it became cold as winter ice. 2 weeks before the wedding, Thomas came to visit. He sat in Aunt Mehitable's parlor drinking her best tea and talking about his plans for Prudence. How she would tend his animals and cook his meals and warm his bed. How she would give him strong sons to work the land. "She is a quiet one," he said, looking at Prudence like she was a horse he was thinking of buying. "That is good. I cannot stand women who talk too much. My Mary learned to keep her mouth shut after a few lessons." Prudence felt something cold and wet touch her shoulder. She turned her head slightly and saw the weeping woman standing behind her chair. Water dripped from her hair onto the wooden floor, but neither Thomas nor Mehitable seemed to notice. "Tell him yes, child," the spirit whispered in her ear. "Tell him you will be whatever kind of wife he wants. Let him believe he has won." That night, Prudence sat in her small room reading her mother's journal by candlelight. She had memorized every page by now, the recipes for poisons made from common herbs, the ways to call spirits from their rest, the rituals that could bring water to a drowning man's lungs even if he stood on dry land. But tonight she was looking for something specific, a spell her mother had written about calling the essence of drowning itself. Not just the water, but the panic and terror and helpless struggle that came with it. The victim must look into water while the spell is spoken, her mother had written. A bowl or basin will serve. As they see their reflection, the drowning will begin inside their mind. Their body will follow soon after. Prudence smiled and closed the journal. She knew exactly how Thomas Hartwell would die. The wedding day arrived gray and cold with thick clouds that promised rain. The entire village gathered in the small wooden church to watch Thomas claim his young bride. Prudence wore her mother's white dress, which Aunt Mehitable had altered to fit. The fabric was yellowed with age and smelled faintly of lavender and secrets. As she walked down the narrow aisle, Prudence could feel eyes watching her from every corner of the church. Some looked at her with pity, others with suspicion. A few of the older women crossed themselves when she passed, as if her very presence brought bad luck. Thomas stood at the altar wearing his best coat, which was still stained with dirt and grease. His hair was slicked back with bear fat, and his face was red from the flask he kept hidden in his pocket. When he saw Prudence approaching, he smiled, and she could see several missing teeth. The minister began the ceremony with a prayer asking God to bless this union. Prudence bowed her head and pretended to listen, but her attention was focused on the small silver basin that sat on the altar. It held holy water for the final blessing, but Prudence had other plans for it. When the time came for Thomas to place the ring on her finger, Prudence looked up into his watery blue eyes. He was sweating despite the cold, and his hands shook slightly. Perhaps some part of him sensed what was coming. "Do you, Thomas Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Thomas said, and slipped the thin gold band onto Prudence's finger. The metal was warm from his pocket, but the moment it touched her skin, it became cold as river ice. Thomas jerked his hand back in surprise and stared at the ring as frost began to form around it. "Do you, Prudence Fairweather, take this man to be your lawful husband?" the minister continued, not noticing Thomas's confusion. "I do," Prudence said, and turned toward the silver basin. She could see Thomas's reflection in the still water. His face looked pale and frightened, as if he suddenly understood that something was very wrong. Prudence began to speak the words her mother had written. Not aloud, but in her mind, directing them at the water and the face she saw there. "By water you lived, and by water you shall die. Feel the river in your lungs. Taste the mud in your throat. Know the fear of those you have drowned." Thomas gasped and put his hand to his throat. His eyes went wide and he began to make choking sounds. The wedding guests turned to stare as he fell to his knees beside the altar. "I cannot breathe," he wheezed. "Something is wrong, there is water in my chest." The minister knelt beside him and tried to help. But Thomas was beyond saving. His face turned blue, and foam began to pour from his mouth. Not ordinary foam, but thick, muddy water that smelled of river weeds and dead fish. He clawed at his throat and gasped for air that would not come. Women screamed and men shouted for the doctor, but everyone could see it was too late. Thomas Hartwell was drowning on dry land in front of 50 witnesses, and no one could explain how or why. As he died, his eyes found Prudence's face. In that final moment, she saw recognition there. He knew somehow that she had done this to him, that his young bride had become his executioner. Then the light went out of his eyes and he collapsed onto the wooden floor. The church erupted in chaos. People ran for the doors or fell to their knees in prayer. Some pointed at Prudence and whispered about witchcraft. Others claimed it was divine judgment for Thomas's sins. But Prudence stood perfectly still beside the altar. The silver basin had turned black as midnight and steam rose from its surface. In the dark water she could see the weeping woman's face smiling up at her. "Well done, my daughter," the spirit's voice echoed in her mind. "You have taken your first step on the path of justice. But this is only the beginning. There are so many more who need to pay for their crimes." Prudence looked around at the terrified faces surrounding her. These people had known what Thomas was. They had known he hurt his wife and terrorized his servants. But they had said nothing because it was easier to look away. Now they would learn that some debts could never be forgiven, and Prudence Fairweather would be the one to collect them all. She smiled and pulled the wedding ring from her finger. It clattered to the floor beside Thomas's body, still covered in frost despite the warm spring day. 6 months had passed since Thomas Hartwell drowned at his own wedding. The village of Salem now whispered Prudence's name only in daylight, and never when children might hear. She had become the cursed widow who brought death wherever she walked. But Prudence did not care about their whispers. She had found something far more interesting to occupy her thoughts. Every Sunday she watched Elizabeth Ashford sit in the front pew of the church with her perfect family. Elizabeth had everything Prudence had never known. A husband who smiled at her with genuine love. 3 healthy children who laughed and played without fear. A home filled with warmth and joy instead of shadows and secrets. Elizabeth Ashford was everything the village women aspired to be. She baked the best bread. She sewed the finest clothes. She never raised her voice or showed anger, even when her children misbehaved. The other wives looked to her for advice, and the unmarried girls hoped to be like her someday. This perfection made Prudence's teeth ache with jealousy. The hatred began simply enough. Elizabeth had been kind to Prudence after Thomas's death, bringing soup and offering prayers. But kindness from someone who had never known real suffering felt like mockery. Then came the Sunday when Elizabeth made her mistake. After church services, Elizabeth was talking with other village women about Prudence's string of misfortunes. First her mother's early death, then her father's sudden passing, then her husband dying on their wedding day. "Perhaps," Elizabeth said in her gentle voice, "these tragedies are God's way of calling Prudence to examine her heart. Sometimes the Lord sends trials to those who harbor secret sins." The words spread through Salem village like smoke on the wind. By evening, everyone was discussing Elizabeth's suggestion that Prudence might be cursed because of her own wickedness. The sympathy that had protected her began to crumble, replaced by suspicion and fear. That night, the weeping woman came to Prudence angrier than she had ever seen her. The spirit's form was more solid now, fed by all the death and terror that had occurred. Her white dress no longer hung in tatters but flowed around her like liquid moonlight. Her eyes burned with cold fire. "That woman dares to judge you," the spirit hissed. Water dripped from her words and pooled on the floor. "She who has never known hunger or fear or loss. She who sleeps safely in her husband's arms while other women cower from their men's fists." "What should I do?" Prudence asked, though she already knew the answer. "Take from her what she values most. Show her what real loss feels like. Let her learn that some sorrows cannot be healed with prayer and good intentions." The weeping woman raised her hand, and the air in Prudence's room grew thick with the scent of grave dirt and stagnant water. "But first you must learn new skills, my daughter. The children will require a different touch than their father." Through the long winter nights that followed, Prudence learned to speak with spirits other than the weeping woman. The first to answer her call was little Mary, a child who had died of fever 20 years before. Mary's ghost appeared as a girl of 7 with skin like blue milk and eyes that wept constantly. "I remember being sick. little Mary whispered when she first manifested. I remember the burning and the cold and how my mother cried over my bed. Death was not so bad, but staying behind has been very lonely. Little Mary taught Prudence how to slip into children's dreams, how to plant seeds of terror that would grow in their sleeping minds, how to make them see things that were not there and hear voices calling from dark corners. Children are easier to frighten than adults, the child spirit explained. Their minds are still soft and open. They believe what they see even when it makes no sense. As winter gave way to spring, strange things began happening in the Ashford household. It started with small disturbances that could be explained away. Toys found in different rooms than where they had been left. Doors that creaked open in the night. The sound of children's laughter echoing through empty hallways. Samuel Ashford, the eldest boy at 9 years old, was the first to report seeing things. He told his parents about the pale girl who stood at the foot of his bed watching him sleep. She never spoke, but her presence filled him with a dread he could not name. It was just a dream, son, his father John said. But Samuel shook his head. She was real, Papa. She left wet footprints on the floor. Elizabeth checked Samuel's room but found nothing unusual. She told herself that children often had vivid nightmares and that this would pass. But the dreams did not stop. They grew worse. Soon all 3 Ashford children were waking in terror. 7-year-old Rebecca claimed invisible hands tried to pull her underwater during her evening bath. 5-year-old Jonathan refused to go near the well, saying he could hear voices calling to him from the depths. The disturbances escalated quickly. Puddles of brackish water appeared overnight in impossible places. The upstairs hallway, the children's beds, inside closed cabinets and drawers. The water smelled of river mud and decay, and no amount of mopping could remove the stains it left behind. Elizabeth tried everything she could think of to help her children. She burned sage to cleanse the house. She hung iron horseshoes over every door. She even consulted the village wise woman who sold charms and protective herbs. Nothing worked. The toys began moving on their own in full daylight. Samuel's wooden horse would be found galloping in circles around the kitchen table. Rebecca's doll would turn its head to follow people as they walked past. Jonathan's toy soldiers arranged themselves in formations that spelled out words no 5-year-old should know. But the worst was the sound that came every night at the stroke of midnight. A child's music box playing a funeral hymn that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. When the family searched for the source, they found nothing. The melody would stop the moment they lit a candle and began to look. Elizabeth aged years in a matter of weeks. Dark circles appeared under her eyes and her hands shook constantly. She jumped at every sound and rarely smiled. The perfect wife and mother the village had admired was disappearing before everyone's eyes. Something is wrong in that house, the neighbors began to whisper. Something unnatural has taken hold. John Ashford hired men to search every inch of his property looking for whatever was tormenting his family. They found nothing, but the attacks continued, growing more violent each night. On the night of the spring equinox, when the veil between worlds grows thin, Prudence decided it was time to finish what she had started. She sat in her small room surrounded by candles, arranged in a circle, drawn from her mother's journal. In the center, she placed a bowl of water taken from Salem Creek under the full moon. "Little Mary," she called softly, "are you ready to help me collect what Elizabeth Ashford owes?" The child spirit materialized slowly, her form more solid than ever before. Behind her came other shapes. The ghosts of children who had died in Salem Village over the years. Some from fever, others from accidents or violence. All of them hungry for warmth and life and jealous of those who still possessed what they had lost. "Yes," little Mary said, and her voice echoed with the voices of all the dead children. "We are ready to play." That night, Elizabeth Ashford experienced every mother's worst nightmare. She woke to find her children standing at her bedside, but their eyes were empty black holes that reflected no light. When she tried to touch them, her hands passed through them like smoke. The real Samuel, Rebecca, and Jonathan lay in their beds upstairs, drowning in their sleep. No water touched their bodies, but their lungs filled nonetheless. They gasped and struggled and called for their mother, but she could not hear them over the sound of spectral children laughing in the darkness below. One by one, the Ashford children stopped breathing. Elizabeth found them in the morning peaceful, as if they had simply chosen not to wake up. The perfect mother who had judged Prudence for her losses now knew what real grief felt like. The sound carried across the village, and everyone who heard it felt their blood turn cold. At her window across town, Prudence smiled and closed her mother's journal. Justice had been served once again. Elizabeth Ashford had learned that no one was safe from the consequences of their words. The weeping woman appeared beside her, looking pleased. "Well done, my daughter. You have mastered the art of taking what matters most. But tell me, how did it feel to watch a mother's heart break?" Prudence thought for a moment, savoring the memory of Elizabeth's anguish. "It felt like the first warm day of spring," she said. "Like something frozen inside me finally began to thaw." The spirit nodded approvingly. "Good. You are becoming what you were meant to be. Soon you will be ready for even greater work." 2 weeks after the Ashford children were found dead in their beds, a stranger rode into Salem Village. His name was Cornelius Whitmore, and he came from Boston carrying official papers from the Colonial government. The papers gave him authority to investigate the recent deaths that had plagued the community. Whitmore was not like the local men. He was tall and lean, with gray hair tied back in a simple queue. His clothes were plain but well made, and his eyes were the color of winter ice. Most importantly, he carried himself like a man who had seen terrible things and was not easily frightened. The magistrate set up his office in the village inn and began calling people to testify about what they had witnessed. One by one, the villagers came forward with their stories. The merchant who had seen Thomas Hartwell drown in muddy water on dry land. The churchwomen who had watched the Ashford children waste away, despite showing no signs of illness. The farmers who reported strange lights moving through the woods at night. But every story seemed to circle back to one name: Prudence Fairweather. "She was there when Thomas died," whispered Martha Corey, an elderly woman who rarely spoke ill of anyone, standing calm as you please while he choked on river water that came from nowhere. "The troubles in the Ashford house started right after Elizabeth spoke against her," added Samuel Parris, the village minister. "Before that, their home was a place of joy and laughter." Whitmore listened to each account without showing emotion. He asked careful questions and wrote detailed notes in a leather-bound journal. Unlike the local authorities, he did not immediately cry witchcraft or call for burnings. Instead, he treated each death like a puzzle that could be solved through reason and investigation. What the villagers did not know was that Magistrate Whitmore had his own reasons for taking these deaths seriously. 5 years earlier, his own daughter had drowned in a pond near their home in Boston. The water had been only knee-deep, but somehow she had been unable to save herself. Her body was found floating face down with no injuries to explain her death. Since then, Whitmore had made it his business to study unexplained drownings throughout the colonies. He had seen enough to know that some deaths defied natural explanation. He had also learned to recognize the signs of supernatural influence, and more importantly, how to protect himself from it. Around his neck he wore a small silver cross blessed by 3 different ministers. In his pockets he carried iron nails hammered from horseshoes and salt taken from a church altar. These protections had kept him safe through previous investigations, but he sensed this case would test them more than any before. Prudence knew about the magistrate's arrival within hours. Little Mary brought her the news floating through her window like morning mist. "A man has come asking questions about you," the child spirit reported. "He carries holy things and speaks of justice instead of vengeance. This one may be dangerous." That night, Prudence decided to pay Magistrate Whitmore a visit of her own. Not in person, of course, but through the network of spirits she now commanded. She sent the weeping woman to observe him while he slept and report back what she learned. The spirit returned before dawn, looking troubled. "He does not dream as other men do," she told Prudence. "His sleep is guarded by prayers and protected by blessed objects. I could not enter his mind or fill his lungs with water. Something shields him from our touch." This news both frustrated and intrigued Prudence. No one had been able to resist her power before. The challenge excited her in a way she had not felt since her first kill. Over the following days, Whitmore continued his investigation. He visited the sites where each death had occurred and examined them with the careful eye of someone trained in detecting deception. At the Hartwell farm, he found traces of ritual symbols carved into the barnwood. In the Ashford house, he discovered hidden caches of strange herbs and animal bones. Most importantly, he found Prudence's childhood home still standing empty since her father's death. The village had avoided the place, claiming it felt cursed, but Whitmore entered without fear. In the cellar beneath loose floorboards, he discovered Elizabeth Fairweather's journal. The book contained everything: recipes for poisons and love potions, instructions for calling spirits from their rest, most damning of all, detailed accounts of how to kill using supernatural means while leaving no evidence that would satisfy earthly courts. "So," Whitmore said aloud as he read the journal by lamplight, "the daughter learned from the mother's teachings. But knowing how she does it is only half the battle. Now I must prove it." That night, Prudence decided it was time to deal with the magistrate directly. If her spirits could not reach him in sleep, then she would have to be more creative. She chose to strike at him through his investigation itself. The papers and evidence Whitmore had gathered began to disappear or change overnight. Witness statements burst into flames when he tried to read them. His careful notes turned to blank pages covered in muddy water stains. The journal he had found crumbled to dust the moment he tried to show it to another person. But Whitmore was not easily discouraged. Each morning he would start again, rewriting his notes from memory and seeking new evidence. His determination began to worry Prudence in a way she had never experienced before. "He will not give up," she told the weeping woman during one of their nightly conferences. "Every time I destroy his work, he begins again. What manner of man is this?" "A dangerous one," the spirit replied. "He has lost someone to drowning as you have lost family to cruelty. Grief makes men stubborn and pain gives them strength. You must be more direct in dealing with him." Prudence decided to try a different approach. Instead of attacking Whitmore's investigation, she would attack his mind. She sent little Mary and a dozen other child spirits to haunt his waking hours. They would appear in mirrors when he shaved, whisper his name when he walked alone, leave wet handprints on surfaces he had just touched. The psychological assault continued for a full week. The magistrate grew pale and thin from lack of sleep. His hands began to shake and he started talking to himself when he thought no one was listening. The villagers whispered that investigating witchcraft had driven him mad. But on the 8th night, Whitmore surprised everyone. He sent word throughout Salem Village that he had solved the case. He had found evidence that would clear Prudence Fairweather of all suspicion. He requested that she meet him at the old mill by Salem Creek to receive his formal apology. Prudence read the message with growing excitement. Had she finally broken his mind completely? Was he surrendering to her power? She decided to go to the meeting confident that she would finish what her spirits had started. The old mill sat beside Salem Creek in a grove of twisted oak trees. Water from the creek turned a great wooden wheel that powered the grinding stones inside. On this night, the wheel was still and the building stood dark against the starlit sky. Prudence arrived at midnight wearing her mother's black cloak. She expected to find Whitmore cowering and broken, ready to beg for mercy. Instead, she found him standing calmly in the moonlight holding a lantern that cast strange shadows. "Good evening, Miss Fairweather," he said in a voice that showed no fear. "Thank you for coming. I have indeed learned the truth about recent events in our village." "And what truth is that, magistrate?" Prudence asked, though something about his manner made her skin crawl with unease. "The truth that you are a murderer who uses supernatural means to kill innocent people. The truth that you learned your dark arts from your mother's journal. The truth that you command spirits to do your bidding, while you pretend to be a victim of circumstance." Prudence felt her confidence begin to crack. This was not the broken man she had expected to meet. "You cannot prove any of that. You have no evidence that would stand in any court." Whitmore smiled and raised his lantern higher. In its light, Prudence could see that the ground around the mill had been marked with symbols, drawn in what looked like salt mixed with holy water. She was standing in the center of a trap. "You are right," Whitmore said. "I cannot prove your guilt in a court of law, but I do not need to. Tonight justice will be served by other means." Prudence tried to call upon the weeping woman but felt nothing. The spirits that usually answered her summons remained silent. The protective circle Whitmore had drawn was keeping them away. For the first time since her father's death, Prudence Fairweather felt truly afraid. Prudence stared at Magistrate Whitmore across the circle of blessed salt that trapped her like a cage. For the first time in months, she felt truly powerless. The spirits that had become her constant companions were silent. The cold touch that had made her feel strong was gone. She was alone with a man who knew exactly what she was. "You cannot hold me here forever," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "The salt will wash away with the first rain. The holy water will lose its power." Whitmore nodded calmly. "You are correct. But I do not need forever. I only need until sunrise, when the village men arrive to escort you to Boston for trial." "What trial?" Prudence laughed, though the sound came out harsh and bitter. "You have no witnesses who will speak against me. No evidence that any earthly court would accept. I am a poor widow who has suffered nothing but tragedy." "Perhaps," Whitmore replied. "But there are other courts than earthly ones. Other judges than mortal men. You have made enemies in the spirit world, Miss Fairweather. Not all the dead approve of how you have used their realm for murder." As if summoned by his words, new shapes began to appear at the edge of the circle. Not the familiar spirits Prudence commanded, but others she had never seen before. They were the ghosts of her victims. Thomas Hartwell stood dripping with muddy water. The three Ashford children held hands in a line, their eyes still black holes of accusation. But there were others too, spirits of people she had never killed, but who had died unjustly in Salem Village over the years. They surrounded the circle like a jury of the damned come to witness her judgment. "You see," Whitmore continued, watching the gathering spirits with satisfaction, "death creates its own justice. You thought you were serving righteousness by punishing the guilty, but murder is still murder regardless of the victim's sins." Prudence felt panic rising in her chest. She was trapped not just by salt and holy water, but by the consequences of her own actions. Still, she was not ready to surrender. If she could not call her usual spirits, perhaps she could bargain with darker forces. From her mother's journal, she remembered references to something called the Devil's Wedding, a ritual that could grant immortality and unlimited power over the spirit world. The price was steep, but Prudence no longer cared about costs. She wanted only to survive and continue her work. But first she had to escape Whitmore's trap. "You think you have won, Magistrate," she said, stepping closer to the edge of the circle. "But you understand nothing about the forces you are dealing with. I am not some village hedge witch brewing love potions in her kitchen. I am something far more dangerous." "What are you, then?" Whitmore asked, though his hand moved instinctively to the blessed cross around his neck. "I am the daughter of spirits older than your God," Prudence replied, and felt truth in the words even as she spoke them. "I am justice given form and purpose. I am the price that evil men must pay for their crimes." As she spoke, the ground beneath her feet began to crack. Steam rose from the fissures, carrying the smell of sulfur and burning stone. The salt circle that had contained her started to turn black and crumble. Whitmore stepped backward, raising his lantern like a shield. "Impossible. The protection should hold until dawn." "Your protections work against spirits, Magistrate. But I am no longer entirely spirit. I am becoming something else. Something that exists between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." The transformation Prudence described was real. Months of communion with supernatural forces had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her body was still flesh and blood, but her spirit had become something hybrid, part human and part otherworldly entity. The circle broke completely and Prudence stepped free. The gathered spirits of her victims tried to approach her but found themselves unable to come close. Whatever she was becoming, it was beyond their power to judge or punish. "Now, Magistrate," she said, advancing on Whitmore with slow, deliberate steps. "Let me show you what happens to men who interfere with forces beyond their comprehension." But Whitmore surprised her again. Instead of running or begging for mercy, he pulled something from his coat. It was a small leather pouch that smelled of grave dirt and dried blood. "Before you kill me," he said calmly, "there is something you should know. I did not come to Salem Village to investigate random deaths. I came looking specifically for you. That is impossible. No one outside this village even knows I exist. Your mother's journal was not the only record she kept. She also wrote letters to others like herself, women who practiced the old arts and served the ancient spirits. One of those letters reached my wife before she died." Whitmore opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the ground. They were human bones ground to powder and mixed with ash from a church that had been struck by lightning. The mixture began to smoke and glow with unnatural light. My wife was a wise woman, Miss Fairweather. She could see things that others missed. In her final letter, she warned me about you. She said that Elizabeth Fairweather's daughter would one day become a great evil, that someone would need to stop you before you grew too powerful to defeat. Your wife is dead. Prudence snarled. Whatever power she had died with her. Did it? Whitmore asked and smiled grimly. Look around you. Do you see her among the spirits gathered here tonight? Prudence turned and gasped. Standing apart from the other ghosts was a woman she did not recognize. The spirit was tall and elegant with silver hair and eyes that burned with inner light. Unlike the other dead, she did not look angry or accusatory. She looked sad. Hello, child, the spirit said in a voice like wind through autumn leaves. I am Margaret Whitmore. I have been watching you for some time. Impossible, Prudence whispered. I would have sensed another practitioner of the arts. You would have if I were still alive. But death has given me new sight and new purpose. I have spent 5 years preparing for this moment, learning how to bind a spirit that exists between worlds, gathering the materials needed to cage something that is neither fully alive nor completely dead. The bone powder on the ground began to form patterns that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to twist and move when viewed directly. The air above them shimmered like heat rising from summer stones. This is a trap designed specifically for you, Prudence Fairweather, Margaret Whitmore continued. Not to kill you, for you are already too close to death. Not to banish you, for you belong neither to this world nor the next. Instead, it will bind you to a single place where you can do no more harm. What place? Prudence asked, though she feared the answer. The ruins of the old church in Gallows Wood, Cornelius Whitmore replied. The place where Salem Village once tried to build a house of God but failed when lightning struck it down. You will become its eternal guardian, able to kill only those foolish enough to seek you out. The binding ritual began in earnest. Margaret Whitmore's spirit chanted in a language that predated English or Latin or any human tongue. The bone powder circle around Prudence began to glow brighter. She felt invisible chains wrapping around her spirit, tethering her to a place she had never seen but somehow knew, with perfect clarity. No, she screamed, calling desperately for the weeping woman or little Mary or any of the spirits who had served her. But none came. They were bound by the same ancient laws that were now claiming her. This is not justice, she cried as the ritual neared completion. I punished the guilty. I gave voice to those who had been silenced. Perhaps, Margaret Whitmore said sadly. But you also murdered innocents. You killed children to hurt their mother. You became the very evil you claimed to fight against. The binding completed with a sound like thunder rolling across clear skies. Prudence felt herself pulled away from the mill by forces she could not resist. The last thing she saw was Cornelius Whitmore kneeling beside his wife's spirit, as both of them faded into the approaching dawn. When awareness returned, Prudence found herself standing in the ruins of a stone church deep in the woods outside Salem Village. Moss covered the broken walls and trees grew through gaps in what had once been the roof. It was a place of decay and abandonment, perfect for someone caught between life and death. She tried to leave but found invisible barriers blocking every path away from the ruins. She could move freely within the sacred ground but could not step beyond its boundaries. The binding had worked exactly as intended, but Prudence was not entirely defeated. If she could not hunt her prey, then she would have to make them come to her. She began to call out with her voice, letting it carry on the wind to any who might hear. Come to me, she whispered to the darkness. Come to Gallows Wood and learn the truth about death. Come and I will show you wonders beyond imagination. Some would hear her call and be drawn to investigate. Curious travelers and thrill-seekers and those who thought themselves brave enough to face whatever haunted the old ruins. They would provide the sustenance she needed to maintain her existence between worlds. Prudence smiled as she settled into her new prison. It was not the immortal power she had sought, but it would do. She had all of eternity to perfect her craft and an endless supply of victims foolish enough to seek her out. The Devil's Bride had found her eternal home. The binding ritual was complete. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees around Salem Creek, Magistrate Cornelius Whitmore watched his wife's spirit fade into the morning light. Her final act of love had been to help him trap the most dangerous killer he had ever encountered. But the cost had been higher than he expected. The ritual that bound Prudence Fairweather to the ruined church had also bound part of his own soul to the task of watching over her prison. He would live out his natural life, but when death claimed him, he would become the eternal guardian, ensuring she never escaped. "It is done, my love," he whispered to the empty air where Margaret had stood. "She can harm no more innocents." But even as he spoke the words, Whitmore wondered if they were true. He had contained Prudence, but he had not destroyed her. Something that existed between life and death could not be killed by mortal means. The best he had managed was to limit the scope of her evil. In the ruins of the old church deep in Gallows Wood, Prudence explored the boundaries of her new prison. The sacred ground covered perhaps an acre, including the broken stone walls and the ancient cemetery behind them. Within this space, she was free to move and shape reality to her will. Beyond it lay invisible barriers that burned like fire when she tried to cross them. The first weeks of her imprisonment were filled with rage. She screamed curses at the empty forest and called upon every spirit she had ever contacted. None came. The binding ritual had severed her connection to the network of ghosts that had been her source of power. But slowly, Prudence began to adapt to her new existence. If she could not command armies of spirits, she would have to rely on her own abilities. And those abilities were growing stronger every day. The transformation that had started months earlier was accelerating now that she was cut off from the world of the living. Her physical form became more ghost-like, while her spirit gained the solid presence of the truly dead. She could appear and disappear at will within the church ruins. She could make herself invisible or take on the appearance of anyone who had ever died on the consecrated ground. Most importantly, she discovered that she could project her voice far beyond the boundaries that held her body. Her whispers could reach the minds of sensitive individuals for miles around. Lonely travelers walking forest paths would hear her calling. Children playing near the woods would catch fragments of her songs. "Come to me," she would whisper into dreams and quiet moments. "Come to Gallows Wood and I will show you such wonders. Come and learn the secrets that the living fear to know." The first to answer her call came 3 months after her imprisonment. He was a young man from a neighboring village who fancied himself a scholar of supernatural lore. He had heard rumors about the haunted church ruins and decided to investigate. Prudence watched him approach through the trees carrying a satchel of books and what he imagined were protective charms. She could smell his excitement and curiosity from 100 yards away. He wanted to encounter a ghost to prove that his studies had meaning. She gave him exactly what he sought. When he entered the ruins, she appeared as a beautiful young woman in a white dress. Her face was pale but lovely, and her voice was sweet as honey. She told him tales of tragic love and unjust death. She made herself seem like a victim in need of his help and understanding. "I have been so lonely," she whispered, taking his hand in hers. "So many years with no one to talk to. No one who understands what it means to exist between worlds." The young scholar was enchanted. He spent hours listening to her stories and asking questions about the nature of death and spirits. When evening came, he made camp among the ruins, eager to continue their conversation the next day. But Prudence had grown hungry during their long talk. Months without feeding on fear and death had left her weak and fading. She needed sustenance to maintain her existence, and this foolish boy had delivered himself directly to her. That night, as he slept, she showed him her true nature. The beautiful ghost became a thing of shadow and malice. She filled his dreams with images of his own death played out in a dozen different ways. She made him feel the cold touch of the grave and the weight of earth on his chest. He woke screaming, but could not escape the nightmare. Even awake, he continued to see visions of his corpse rotting in the ruins while his family searched desperately for his body. The terror fed Prudence, making her stronger and more solid. By dawn, the young scholar was dead, not from any wound or poison, but from sheer terror. His heart had simply stopped beating when his mind could no longer bear the visions she had forced upon him. Prudence felt renewed by his death. The fear he had experienced in his final hours sustained her for weeks. But more importantly, his death proved that her prison was not as complete as Whitmore had intended. She could still kill. She could still feed on human terror. The scholar's disappearance was reported to the authorities, but no one thought to search the cursed ruins in Gallows Wood. The local people avoided the place instinctively, knowing that something evil dwelt there. Over the following years, more curious souls were drawn to investigate the haunted church. Thrill seekers and treasure hunters, and those who thought themselves brave enough to face whatever lurked in the shadows. Some came alone, while others arrived in groups convinced that numbers would protect them. All of them died. Prudence perfected her craft during these encounters. She learned to read people's deepest fears and use them as weapons. The man afraid of drowning would find himself struggling in phantom water. The woman who feared her abusive father would see his ghost rising from the ancient graves. The child afraid of the dark would be consumed by shadows that moved and hungered. Each death made her stronger, but also more inhuman. The part of her that had once been a frightened teenage girl faded completely. What remained was something that existed solely to cause terror and feed on the resulting death. Decades passed, and Prudence became a local legend. Parents used her story to frighten misbehaving children. Be good, or the witch in Gallows Wood will come for you. Travelers were warned to avoid certain paths through the forest, especially on moonless nights when her voice carried farthest. But legends also attracted those who saw them as challenges to overcome. In 1742, exactly 50 years after her binding, a group of ministers arrived at the ruins determined to exorcise whatever evil dwelt there. They came armed with holy water and blessed silver and prayers in Latin. They were confident that their faith would protect them. Prudence laughed when she sensed their approach. Faith was a shield only for those whose hearts were pure. These men carried secrets and shames that made them vulnerable despite their religious authority. She appeared to them as their victims, the servant girls they had pressured into their beds, the wives they had beaten behind closed doors, the children they had hurt while preaching about divine love. One by one, the ministers broke under the weight of their own guilt made manifest. They saw their sins given form and voice, and they could not bear the sight. By morning, all 5 lay dead among the ruins, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. Their deaths were blamed on bandits or wild animals. No one wanted to admit that men of God had been killed by supernatural means, but the truth spread in whispers, and the ruins gained an even darker reputation. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Prudence noticed changes in the world beyond her prison. The people who came to her were different now. They spoke of revolutions and new nations and scientific discoveries that would have seemed like magic to the Puritan villagers of her youth. But human nature remained the same. People were still driven by curiosity and greed and the desire to prove themselves braver than their neighbors. They still came to Gallows Wood seeking thrills or treasure, or simply to test themselves against the supernatural. And they still died screaming her name. In 1892, exactly 200 years after her binding, a team of investigators from Boston arrived with new tools and scientific methods. They brought cameras and recording devices and instruments designed to detect supernatural activity. Prudence was fascinated by their equipment. She had learned to interact with metal and electricity over the centuries. She could make their cameras capture images of things that were not there. She could make their recording cylinders play back the voices of the dead. But in the end, technology could not protect them any better than faith had protected the ministers. The investigators died just as horribly as all the others. Their modern tools simply gave them new ways to document their own terror. The 20th century brought even more changes. Automobiles replaced horses and carriages, making it easier for the curious to reach remote locations. Newspapers and later radio spread stories of the haunted ruins to ever wider audiences. Prudence adapted to each new era while remaining fundamentally unchanged. She was death-given form and purpose. She was the price that mortals paid for their hubris and cruelty. She was eternal as long as human beings continued to be drawn to forbidden knowledge and dark places. In 1992, 300 years after her binding, a group of paranormal investigators arrived with video cameras and electronic sensors. They planned to spend the night in the ruins and document whatever they encountered. Prudence watched them set up their equipment with the patience of centuries. These modern ghost hunters were no different from the Puritan ministers or the Victorian spiritualists who had come before them. They thought their technology made them special, but they were still just mortals walking into a predator's den. "Welcome, children," she whispered as they prepared to spend the night among the ancient stones. "I have been waiting for you for such a very long time." The investigators turned on their cameras and began their vigil, never knowing they were recording their own deaths. By morning, they would join the countless others who had fed Prudence's hunger over the centuries, and somewhere in the modern world, another group was already planning their own expedition to the mysterious ruins in Gallows Wood. The legend of Prudence Fairweather continued to draw new victims like moths to a flame. She had all of eternity to wait for them. Time meant nothing to something trapped between life and death. She would endure until the last human drew their final breath and the world fell silent around her ancient prison. But until that final day, she would continue her work. She would punish the curious and feed on their terror. She would remain what she had always been since that first night when the weeping woman called her name. Prudence Fairweather, the devil's daughter, the eternal bride of death itself. In the ruins of Gallows Wood, something that was no longer entirely human smiled and began to sing. Her voice carried on the wind, reaching the ears of those who walked alone in dark places. Those who would hear her call and be drawn to investigate. The cycle would begin again as it always had, and always would, until the end of time itself.